There are several hypotheses. So one is Luca had one type, and then one of the two types came up with the other. Another hypothesis is the other way around. So it had the other type, and then the first type came up. And we are saying that there was a membrane, but it was neither of the two.
So your study, your analysis suggests that this Luca, the last common ancestor, it must have had these leaky membranes, it must have lived down on these alkaline vents, and then given rise to these two very different archaea and bacteria. What's the evidence that this might have actually happened in reality?
That's a very interesting question for a scientist studying the origin of life. So we normally get asked this question, what's the evidence? And it's a very tricky one to answer because in origin of life, it's such an early thing that you're looking at that there is no evidence. There just isn't any evidence. We want to think there is, but it's only secondary evidence based on current structures of cells and current geological systems and genes. So we can look at current genes and see what is common and what is not, and then try to infer what was there at the beginning. We can look at current geological systems and then conclude how they may have looked back then. So if you look at the genes that make the ATP synthase, they are very similar in the archaea and the bacteria and also the eukaryotes, which came derived from the other two. But when you look at the proteins that make the membrane, they are entirely different. There is nothing in common, not a single base. They are completely different. So when you think about it, is what exactly is happening here? How can these proteins be the same and these other proteins be so different? The only conclusion we could drive from this is, well, they just weren't there. They came later. And the hypothesis is they came later because if they had come earlier, you would kill yourself. Because if you have a good membrane, you essentially starve yourself to death. So it's not advantageous. So in terms of natural selection, it's not selected. It's not favorable to have a good membrane. What happened was, we think, another protein came first. And this is a protein called a sodium proton antiporter. And this protein does something very peculiar. It takes protons in, which are very, very small and very, very leaky, and it sends sodium out, which is actually very, very able to stay outside. It's very unlikely to come back in. So you send sodium out, and that gives you a sodium gradient with the proton gradient. So now you have two gradients that you can use to make ATP.
So basically the recipe you needed was this alkaline vent, so you've got acid and alkali. You need this Luca, this early ancestor with a leaky membrane so that things can come in, things can go out, it can generate energy. And then basically you need to evolve a way of sustaining that gradient outside the vent, and that's how we get our bacteria and our archaea.
Yes, exactly. So there are two things you need to leave this geological system. One is the pump, and the other one is the membrane. They are interrelated. So you need a good membrane to be able to pump, but if you get a good membrane before you start pumping, then you kill yourself.
So from the same common ancestor, there were kind of two groups of organisms that worked out how to fix the problem in a different way, so they could move away from the vents and go off, colonise the world.
Yes, exactly. So for all we know, there may have been many more doing this, but only two succeeded.